Pastor Carrie. Welcome to Sunday School. We are on chapter 16 of the story, The Beginning of the End. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all of his prophets and seers. God said, "Turn from your evil ways. Keep my commands and rules. Obey every part of my law. I commanded your people who lived long ago to obey it, and I gave it to you through my servants, the prophets." 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 13. Elijah and Elisha were prophets who spoke for God to the people of Israel, but Israel would not listen to them. God was angry, but God did not give up. God sent more messengers to speak his words to the kings and to the people, reminding them of his love and asking them to turn back to him. God warned Israel what would happen if they refused, but still they would not listen. Years later, another great prophet, Isaiah, was called by God to be God's voice to the people of Judah. Isaiah reminded the people how important it was to follow God and obey God's rules. But no one listened to God's messenger. They forgot all that God had done for them. They didn't care about God's blessings. Good news, bad news. Isaiah tried to get through to the people, but they wouldn't listen. "I'll try once more," he said to himself. "Listen, everyone. God has some good news and bad news for you," Isaiah began. "God is disappointed that you are disobeying his rules. If you change and turn back to God, God will forgive you and protect you from your enemies. But if you don't change your behavior, you will be punished. This land will be taken over by your enemies. There will be constant sadness and suffering." But the people did not pay much attention. "That old prophet, don't listen to him," they said. Isaiah tried even harder to make them listen. "Here's the good news," he said. "Your God, the one true God, still loves you, even when you disobey. So if you change your ways, God will bring you back to your own land. The evil rulers will go away. God will answer your prayers. God's people will no longer be hungry or thirsty. You will have picnics on the hills and happy days with your children. There will be sheep grazing in the pastures. The Lord will comfort Israel again and make her deserts bloom." Faithful Isaiah tried his best to convince the people to make good choices. He knew that many of the people weren't listening and would have to experience the bad news first. All right, well, let's jump right in. Our story card this week is Isaiah. Our main character is Isaiah. And our key verse is from the book of Isaiah, the 49th chapter, verse 8. And it says, "When it is time to save you, I will help you. I will keep you safe." So just a little bit about Isaiah's life. Isaiah was sent by God to warn people that Jerusalem would fall. Isaiah was a prophet who foretold of Jesus's coming. So we see Jesus, the story of Jesus, the good news of Jesus coming through the cracks in our story. Isaiah spoke to the people about justice and about obedience to God. So often those two things go together. We've learned that before, isn't it? That God never takes God's love away from us. All the good things that God wants to give us are never pulled back away from us, but we are the ones in our choosing. When we choose poorly, when we make bad choices, we block out all the good things God has planned for us. And our story today is no different. God had good things prepared and planned for God's people. But through their bad choices, they were blocking that all out of their lives, and they were suffering, and they were experiencing injustice, not only for themselves, but for people around them. Another unique thing about Isaiah is he was given by God visions of heaven. Isn't that exciting? He had pictures in his mind of what heaven was like, given to him by God. So let's jump right into thinking about our story this week. We've already talked a little bit about it. Today's story is about choices. We were made very uniquely. We were made in the image of God. We were lovingly made in the image of God. And part of that means that we were made to choose. We weren't made to be robots that were just programmed to love God and be in relationship with God. We were made with the ability to choose to love God, to choose to cooperate with God, to choose to have a relationship with God. And that was because God made us with love. God made us with love and with dignity and with sacredness and with worth. We are very important to God. So God didn't make us like robots. So we have this ability to choose, which is wonderful. It's how we're created in God's image. And it's also a little tricky, isn't it? Because we have to choose. We have to choose sometimes between things that are, well, sometimes there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference. Maybe we are actually sometimes we have to choose between two good things. And that may still be a little bit difficult, but doesn't have a lot of negative consequences, does it? But then there are times where we have to choose between something that is actually good news and something that is bad news. And it would seem like, why would we ever choose bad news? But we do sometimes, don't we? People have from the beginning, people in today's story, when faced with a choice, often choose bad news instead of good news. They choose that bad news, which is, of course, doing things their way, instead of the good news, which is doing things God's way. So here we are in the middle of this story this week, chapter 16, and we are faced with some of the same things that the folks in this story were faced with. Choices. Will we choose God's good news, or will we choose bad news that we create for ourselves? Will we welcome in and cooperate with all the good things God has planned for us, or will we block it out? So there's where our two ancient questions come in. Who is God, and what does God want from us? God forgives. That's who God is. God forgives. God forgives us over and over and over again. God's love never ends. Our love sometimes can find its end. It's limited. God's love is limitless. There's no end to God's love. So there's no end to God's forgiveness. And because we want to have a relationship with God, and because God wants to have a relationship with us, we can't take advantage. We've talked about this before, friends. We can't take advantage of knowing this. Knowing that God will always forgive us shouldn't enable us to just do whatever we want. When we know that God will always forgive us, when we know that God's love is limitless, that is meant to encourage us to not disobey, to encourage us to obey God and to build a relationship that's meaningful and that's helpful and that's loving. We don't take advantage of someone's love. When we know someone loves us, we don't want to take advantage of that. We don't want to take advantage of their kindness or their goodness, their forgiveness. We want to build a relationship back with them. And that means in terms of our relationship with God, we need to obey. And that was what Isaiah was sent to tell the people of Israel about, God's people. And they weren't listening. So who is God? God forgives over and over and over again. What does God want from us? God wants us to be like these open hands just ready to receive, ready to cooperate, ready to be in relationship with God, to receive all that love and to respond to that love by having a meaningful relationship with God, with ourselves, with each other, and with the earth. And here's the choice. We can either choose this response, the open hands that are ready to receive all of God's love. That love will change us, transform us, and then we will want to respond in all sorts of loving ways to that love that we've received. This is our choice, or this. Yes, I've got the porcupine out again. This is a soft, cuddly animal, but if this were a real porcupine, we couldn't touch it. We probably couldn't get any closer than this, because we would just anticipate the pain of all of those quills, just how sharp they are and how much all of those quills are saying to us, back off. We're like this sometimes, aren't we? We are sometimes like these porcupines. God's love is trying to come into our lives, and we have these quills that all come up all over us, and we just push God's love out with our disobedience. Our disobedience makes us like these porcupines, where we're just pushing out God's love. And the choice is this or this. Open hands, ready to receive all of God's love, be changed by that love, and respond to that love. That was the choice for the folks in our story today. Isaiah was there to tell them, you can choose good news or you can choose bad news, but you need to choose. And the hope of Isaiah, the hope of God in this story, the hope of God now is that we will choose well, that we will choose to receive God's love. Receive God's love, let it change us, and respond to that love. So, all right, folks, as we continue to ask for those ancient paths, let's be thinking about our choices this week. Let's think about choosing the good way that leads to life everlasting, that leads to rest for our souls. All right, take care, friends, and we will see you in chapter 17. Bye-bye.